Slavery, a word that conjures images of suffering, resistance, and the enduring human spirit. But where did this dark chapter of history begin? And how has it shaped our world today? In this video, we'll journey through the history of slavery, from its ancient origins to its profound impact on modern society. We'll uncover how slavery evolved across different cultures, fueled economies, and sparked movements for freedom. As we explore this harrowing yet essential part of human history, stay with us until the end to discover a surprising connection between indentured servitude and the early American colonies. A little-known fact that sheds new light on the roots of racial inequality in America. This is a story of pain, resilience, and the quest for justice you won't want to miss. The origins of slavery stretch back to the dawn of civilization, deeply intertwined with the social and economic systems of early societies. In ancient Mesopotamia, as early as 3500 BCE, slavery was a common practice, largely arising from warfare, debt, or punishment for crimes. Enslaved individuals, considered property, were essential to Mesopotamian society, working in agriculture, construction, and domestic roles. These laborers were the backbone of large-scale projects like the construction of ziggurats, which symbolized the power and religious devotion of the city-states. In ancient Egypt, slavery was similarly integral, particularly in constructing monumental structures such as the pyramids. Many Egyptian slaves were prisoners of war, captured during military campaigns, while others became slaves due to indebtedness. While some Egyptian slaves could achieve a degree of social mobility, occasionally earning their freedom or gaining minor authority within the household, most remained bound to a life of labor, their status cemented by the rigid social hierarchies of the time. The justification for slavery in these early civilizations was rooted in prevailing power dynamics and social structures. The belief that one human could own another became deeply entrenched, setting a precedent for the systemic exploitation that would evolve over millennia. These early systems of slavery were not mere byproducts of conflict or economic need. They were foundational elements that enabled the growth and stability of some of the world's earliest empires. Understanding the origins of slavery reveals how deeply this institution was woven into the fabric of early human societies, laying the groundwork for the more expansive and racially driven systems of slavery that would emerge in later periods, particularly during the transatlantic slave trade. In the ancient world, slavery was not only widespread, but also deeply embedded in the economic and social structures of powerful civilizations, particularly in ancient Greece and Rome. In Greece, slavery was a ubiquitous institution, with slaves making up a significant portion of the population in many city-states. These individuals were typically war captives, but others were purchased from foreign traders or born into slavery. They performed a wide range of roles: domestic servants, skilled artisans, agricultural laborers, and even workers in the grueling conditions of the silver mines. Despite their crucial contributions, slaves in Greece were considered socially and politically inferior, excluded from citizenship, and denied any political rights. In Rome, slavery was even more integral to the economy and society, with the empire's expansion fueling the demand for enslaved labor. Roman slaves were employed in agriculture, industry, and domestic service, and some were forced into brutal roles such as gladiatorial combat. The Roman economy relied heavily on slave labor, particularly in large agricultural estates known as latifundia, which were essential to Rome's food production. Unlike in Greece, Roman slaves had the possibility of manumission, or being freed by their owners, often as a reward for loyalty or service. However, this was not the norm, and most slaves lived harsh lives under the control of their masters. The widespread use of slavery in these ancient civilizations normalized the concept of human ownership and exploitation, creating a systemic inequality that would influence later societies. The brutal and dehumanizing systems of slavery in Greece and Rome set a precedent for future civilizations, including the racially based slavery that would develop in the Americas. These ancient practices laid the groundwork for an institution that would persist and evolve, shaping human history for centuries to come. Long before the transatlantic slave trade reshaped global history, slavery was already a well-established institution across Africa. However, the nature of slavery on the African continent was markedly different from the chattel slavery that would later dominate the Americas. In many African societies, slavery was deeply connected to kinship, economic systems, and social structures, operating in a more fluid and often less brutal manner. In West Africa, for instance, slavery was frequently linked to warfare, where captives taken in battle were often enslaved. These individuals were usually integrated into the households of their captors, where they performed various roles such as domestic servants, agricultural workers, and skilled artisans. Unlike the hereditary, race-based slavery that would later emerge in the Americas, African slavery was generally not a permanent status. Slaves in Africa could marry, own property, and even rise to prominent positions within their communities. Some were eventually freed and fully integrated into society. The economic importance of slavery in Africa was significant. In powerful kingdoms such as Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, slaves were vital to the production of goods like gold, salt, and agricultural products, which were traded across extensive networks reaching the Sahara and the Mediterranean. This trade integrated African economies into broader global systems long before European intervention. The arrival of European traders in the 15th century marked a turning point. Europeans began to exploit and expand existing African slavery networks, drastically increasing the scale and brutality of the practice. This shift transformed slavery from a relatively localized and culturally integrated institution into a massive, dehumanizing enterprise that fueled the transatlantic slave trade. Understanding slavery in Africa before the transatlantic trade offers a nuanced perspective on how external forces transformed a complex institution into a system of mass exploitation with devastating consequences for the continent and its people. The transatlantic slave trade, beginning in the late 15th century, stands as one of the most harrowing episodes in human history. Fueled by European demand for labor in the New World, this trade forcibly transported millions of Africans across the Atlantic Ocean. The journey, known as the Middle Passage, was marked by extreme brutality. Enslaved Africans were packed tightly into ships, chained together in squalid conditions with little space to move. The voyage could last several weeks, during which time many captives succumbed to disease, malnutrition, or abuse. It is estimated that between 12 and 15 million Africans were shipped to the Americas, with as many as 2 million perishing during the journey. Upon arrival, those who survived the Middle Passage were sold at auctions and forced into lifelong servitude on plantations, where they labored under grueling conditions. These plantations, particularly in the Caribbean, Brazil, and the southern United States, were central to the production of cash crops like sugar, cotton, and tobacco, which were highly profitable for European markets. The wealth generated from this exploitation fueled the growth of European economies and helped finance the Industrial Revolution. But it came at an immense human cost. The transatlantic slave trade not only devastated African societies, leading to the depopulation and destabilization of entire regions, but also entrenched racial ideologies that justified the exploitation and dehumanization of African people. These racist ideologies, developed to rationalize the horrors of the slave trade, would persist long after its abolition, laying the foundation for systemic racism that continues to affect societies around the world. The legacy of the transatlantic slave trade is profound, shaping the economic and social landscapes of the Americas and Europe while leaving deep scars on the African continent. Understanding this dark chapter is crucial to confronting the enduring inequalities and racial prejudices that still resonate today. The introduction of slavery by European colonists in the early 16th century, established a vast and brutal system that profoundly shaped the development of the New World. This institution quickly became the backbone of colonial economies, particularly in the Caribbean, Brazil, and the southern United States. Unlike the more fluid forms of servitude that existed in Africa, slavery in the Americas was strictly race-based and highly commercialized. Enslaved Africans were treated as chattel, property that could be bought, sold, and exploited without regard for their humanity. The plantation system was central to this form of slavery. Enslaved people were forced to work in grueling conditions on large estates, producing lucrative cash crops such as sugar, cotton, and tobacco for European markets. The labor was relentless and dehumanizing. Slaves worked long hours under the constant threat of violence, with minimal food, inadequate shelter, and no medical care. Severe punishment was commonplace, and family separations were frequent, as enslaved individuals were sold off to different owners without notice. The economic success of these plantations was directly tied to the exploitation of slave labor. The immense profits generated by the work of enslaved Africans fueled the growth of European economies and contributed to the rise of global capitalism. However, this wealth came at a tremendous human cost, as millions of people were subjected to unimaginable suffering and denied their basic rights. This system also entrenched a rigid racial hierarchy that persisted long after emancipation, leaving a legacy of systemic racism and inequality. The impact of this brutal institution is still felt today in the social, economic, and cultural landscapes of the Americas. Understanding this history is crucial to addressing the ongoing challenges of racial injustice and inequality. Throughout the history of slavery in the Americas, enslaved people continuously resisted their oppression, displaying remarkable resilience and a relentless pursuit of freedom. Resistance manifested in various forms, from subtle defiance to organized rebellions, each a testament to the human spirit's refusal to be subdued. Day-to-day resistance was common, including work slowdowns, feigned illness, and sabotage. These covert actions disrupted plantation operations and challenged the authority of slave owners. Enslaved people also preserved their cultural practices, languages, and religious beliefs, fostering a sense of identity and community that sustained them in brutal conditions. This cultural resistance provided psychological strength and a means of asserting autonomy in a dehumanizing environment. More overt resistance included escape attempts, with many fleeing to areas where slavery was less entrenched. Some escapees formed maroon communities, autonomous settlements in remote regions like Jamaica, Brazil, and Suriname. These communities not only provided refuge, but also actively resisted recapture, engaging in guerrilla warfare against colonial forces. Large-scale rebellions were the most dramatic form of resistance, such as the Haitian Revolution, 1791-1804, where enslaved Africans successfully overthrew their French rulers, establishing Haiti as the first independent Black republic. This revolution inspired hope among the enslaved and fear among slaveholders across the Americas. Other revolts, like Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831 in the United States, although suppressed, highlighted the deep instability of the slave system. These acts of resistance were crucial in challenging and weakening the institution of slavery, proving that enslaved people were not passive victims but active agents in their fight for liberation. The abolition of slavery was a hard-fought battle driven by decades of persistent activism, moral arguments, and political struggle. Abolitionist movements emerged across the globe, uniting diverse individuals and groups in the mission to end the practice of slavery. These movements were not only about freeing enslaved people, they also sought to redefine societal values around justice, equality, and human rights. In Britain, the abolitionist movement gained significant momentum in the late 18th century. Key figures like William Wilberforce, a passionate member of Parliament, and Olaudah Equiano, a former slave, whose autobiography exposed the horrors of the slave trade, played crucial roles in galvanizing public opinion. Through petitions, speeches, and organized boycotts of goods produced by slave labor, these activists pressured the government to act. Their efforts culminated in the abolition of the slave trade in 1807 and, eventually, the emancipation of all slaves in the British Empire by 1833. In the United States, the abolitionist movement was deeply intertwined with the nation's broader struggles over race, economics, and national identity. Leaders like Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave and powerful orator, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, whose novel Uncle Tom's Cabin stirred anti-slavery sentiment, were instrumental in shaping public opinion. The movement included a wide spectrum of activists, from radical abolitionists calling for immediate emancipation to more moderate reformers advocating for gradual abolition. The fight for abolition in the United States eventually culminated in the Civil War, a bloody conflict in which the issue of slavery was central. President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 and the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865 legally ended slavery, though the struggle for equality continued. Across the Americas, similar movements emerged, each facing unique challenges but sharing the common goal of ending slavery. The abolitionist movements were monumental achievements, but they also left unresolved issues, particularly regarding racial equality, that continue to impact societies today. The legacy of slavery is deeply embedded in the social, economic, and cultural fabric of societies, particularly in the Americas. Although slavery was legally abolished in the 19th century, its impacts continue to resonate, shaping modern life in profound ways. In the United States, the end of slavery was followed by the Reconstruction era, a time of significant social and political change. However, the gains made during Reconstruction were quickly eroded by the rise of Jim Crow laws, which entrenched racial segregation and inequality. These laws, along with widespread discrimination, effectively re-enslaved African Americans in many parts of the country, maintaining a racial hierarchy that persisted well into the 20th century and still influences society today. Economically, the labor of enslaved people fueled the growth of modern capitalism, particularly in the United States and Europe. The profits from slave-produced goods like sugar, cotton, and tobacco helped finance the Industrial Revolution, contributing to the economic power of Western nations. However, this wealth was built on the exploitation of millions, and the resulting economic disparities continue to affect racial groups today, with descendants of enslaved people often facing systemic barriers to wealth and opportunity. Culturally, the legacy of slavery is evident in the rich traditions of the African diaspora. Despite the brutal conditions, enslaved Africans preserved elements of their cultures, including music, religion, and language, which have significantly influenced the cultural landscapes of the Americas. Jazz, blues, gospel music, and various dance forms all have roots in the African traditions brought to the New World. However, the trauma of slavery has left lasting scars, contributing to ongoing struggles against systemic racism and inequality. Addressing this legacy is crucial for achieving true equality in modern societies. While the transatlantic slave trade is often the focus of discussions on slavery, this institution was a global phenomenon with diverse forms and widespread impacts. Across continents, slavery adapted to various social, economic, and cultural contexts, creating complex systems of human exploitation. In the Middle East, the Indian Ocean slave trade paralleled the transatlantic trade. From the 7th century onward, millions of Africans were transported to the Arabian Peninsula, Persia, and South Asia. Unlike in the Americas, many slaves in the Middle East worked in domestic service, military roles, or as concubines. Some, like the Mamluks, even rose to power, but the majority faced severe exploitation and dehumanization, effects of which still linger today in the form of racial discrimination. In Asia, slavery was often tied to local customs. In India, It was linked to the caste system, where lower caste individuals could be forced into bonded labor to repay debts. Although officially abolished, forms of bonded labor persist, reflecting the ongoing challenge of eradicating modern slavery. Even in medieval Europe, slavery existed in the form of serfdom, where peasants were bound to the land of feudal lords. While not chattel slavery, serfs had limited rights and were often treated similarly to property, underscoring how deeply ingrained the concept of human ownership was across different societies. Today, modern slavery, including human trafficking and forced labor, remains a global crisis, affecting millions. This ongoing issue highlights that the fight against slavery is far from over, and that a global perspective is essential for understanding and combating its many forms. By examining slavery from this broader view, we recognize its complexity and the persistent need for global action to address the legacies and modern iterations of this ancient injustice. Before the widespread adoption of African slavery, indentured servitude was a common labor system in the American colonies. This practice involved primarily poor Europeans agreeing to work for a set number of years in exchange for passage to the New World, room and board, and the promise of land or money upon completing their service. While not slaves, indentured servants faced harsh conditions that, in many cases, were strikingly similar to those experienced by enslaved Africans. Indentured servitude became particularly popular in the 17th century, especially in colonies like Virginia and Maryland, where labor was desperately needed for tobacco cultivation. Laborers, mostly from England, Ireland, and Scotland, signed contracts that typically lasted 4 to 7 years. During this time, they had few rights and could be bought, sold, and punished by their masters. Many did not survive their term of service due to the brutal work conditions, poor living environments, and lack of medical care. As the demand for labor grew and the supply of willing European laborers dwindled, colonial landowners began to shift from indentured servitude to African slavery. This transition was driven by economic considerations. Enslaved Africans were seen as a more permanent and controllable labor force, with their servitude being lifelong and hereditary. Additionally, racial distinctions between African slaves and European indentured servants allowed landowners to justify harsher treatment of the former, solidifying racial hierarchies in the colonies. This shift from indentured servitude to racial slavery had profound implications for American society. It marked the beginning of a rigid racial hierarchy that defined social relations in the colonies and later the United States. Understanding the role of indentured servitude helps contextualize the development of slavery and highlights the economic and racial dynamics that shaped early American history. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the complex and often harrowing history of slavery, from its ancient origins to its global reach and enduring legacy. Slavery has left an indelible mark on the world. By exploring the various forms it took across different cultures and times, we gain a clearer understanding of how this institution shaped societies and continues to influence our modern world. The stories of resistance, rebellion, and the tireless fight for abolition remind us of the resilience and strength of the human spirit, even in the face of unimaginable oppression. As we reflect on this history, it's important to recognize that the legacies of slavery, systemic racism, economic disparities, and cultural trauma are still with us today. And now, as promised, here's the surprising fact we hinted at earlier. Did you know that before the widespread shift to African slavery, indentured servitude was so prevalent in early America that many of the first laborers in Virginia and Maryland were white Europeans? This lesser-known aspect of history sheds light on how economic pressures and racial ideologies evolved to create the deeply entrenched system of racial slavery that followed. If you found this exploration thought-provoking, please support our channel, Armchair Archaeology, by liking this video and subscribing for more insightful journeys into the past. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What historical topics should we explore next? Share your ideas in the comments below. Until our next discovery, keep questioning, keep exploring, and let your curiosity guide you toward a deeper understanding of our shared history.